It's going. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Gary, as always. So I hope we'll be able to conclude today the sugya of Gozez. I'm not going to repeat our discussion from the last year, other than to say that we got ourselves a little tied up in knots. But I hope we came out with something clear, which is the view of Rashi, who speaks about in the technicalities of Tolesh, Kotain, and Marit, and what one does in each case. The confusing language of Rashi, which he speaks about being mashlich the kona, discarding the kona, whether this is as per the Ritva, two contradictory explanations of Rashi, or one, whether we get onto issues of melacha shein tzricha legufa, because you're discarding the stem rather than needing it, and perhaps the alternative reading of mashlich, that it means putting aside as opposed to discarding. Anyway, this was the discussion that we had last week. What I want us to do now is really try and learn a piece of Gemara in Bechoros. And originally I had thought we could avoid learning this Gemara, but I think it's proven impossible to so do. It just becomes so intertwined in the sugya. It's just too important a maramokum to miss out. And I printed this Gemara on the handout sheet. This is a Gemara in Bechoros, and I hope with the bits that I cut and paste along with Rashi, people were able to work their way through the Gemara. But basically, the Gemara is talking about, maybe we'll actually have a look at it inside just for a few moments. This is on the third handout sheet, source 2, the Gemara in Bechoros, daf kaf daled on the base to daf kaf hey omud aleph. And the Gemara goes through the two dafim. It starts off with the Mishnah, and the context of the Mishnah is the issa of Gezizas Bechor. One isn't allowed to be Gozez a Bechor. Now, the engine that drives the Gemara is that on the one hand, both Bechor and Shabbos have something in common, which is that Gozez is forbidden with the Bechor. Bechor is the firstborn animal from which one isn't meant to derive any benefit. It's meant to be taken to the Shloim, given to the Kohen as a carbon. And there's a specific Issa Geziza. One isn't allowed to shear the wool off the animal's back, even though you may think this is allowed because it's separate to the animal. This has a commonality with Shabbos, because of course on Shabbos we also know that Gozez is Asa. So one might begin comparing the parameters of these two Isurim. On the other hand, we always need to remember that Shabbos is a melacha rather than just a specific action. And if I can remind you about those who were here from the beginning, those who were right in the early days, if not, I can send the recordings over. When we looked at what a melacha is, we saw a melacha is not just an action, it's an engagement. We use the word asek, an involvement, an activity, immersive in creating a particular outcome as opposed to just a movement and an action. There are many halachas which are relevant to this, which are unique to Hilchos Shabbos because of this distinction. One of these halachas, one of these examples of the difference between whether something is just an action or is a melacha is that of kilach hayad. And I use that example because it's relevant to the sugya in Bechoros. Kilach hayad, or what we often call a shinoi, is when I do an action in an unusual manner. And if I do an action in an unusual manner, with respect to Hilchos Shabbos, we're very used to the idea that it at least makes it a d'Rabbanan and sometimes even mutter completely. This is the idea of shinoi. We sort of take it for granted because it's just something that everyone mentions and is always spoken about. However, the concept of shinoi is a very bizarre one. If someone that stood up in court accused of ritzicha, of murder, and they argued that they had done so with a shinoi and therefore should be exempt, I held the gun with my left hand, I pushed the trigger with my little finger, this would be irrelevant to Hilchos ritzicha. So why is there a concept of shinoi with respect to Hilchos Shabbos? The answer is because with Shabbos it makes sense, where it's an engagement with it, it's an involvement with it, it's the part I play in it. It's not just that of causing a particular outcome, and this is why things, actually bishul, for example, can happen on Shabbos. Something can be cooked on Shabbos as long as I'm not cooking it on Shabbos. Something can be, a fire can be lit on Shabbos using my time switch, as long as I'm not lighting it on Shabbos, and so on with many other examples. Many of the halachos of melachos machshavos, the involvement and the intentionality of melachos are connected with melachot shein tzricha legufa, the concept that I need to do melacha for a particular purpose, are all linked, albeit different halachas, to one broad sort of overarching concept that we're dealing with a melacha over here, an engagement with an activity rather than just a maisa, a cold, dry action. So this is really the basis of the Gemara in Brachos, which is discussing the parameters of the two. And the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, Rabbi Zobin and Mishnah when you need to shecht a bechor, there's a problem that you may need to clear the wool or the hair away from its neck in order to allow the shechita, but we're not allowed to do gaziza, we're not allowed to be gozez. So how can we shecht this bechor? Answers Rabbi Zobin, you are allowed to cut away the wool to clear a space for shechita, as long as you don't remove it. So you can cut the wool in order to clear the space, and you can move the hair, the wool, from side to side in order to create space for the shechita to take place in a halachically viable manner. Nonetheless, you shouldn't pull the hair off, but leave it knotted up with the hair which is still attached to the body of the animal, so explains Rashi, in order that it shouldn't look like Gozez. In other words, in truth, Gozez has happened, but it's okay for whatever reason. You have sheared the wool off the animal at that particular point, but since you don't pull it away from the animal, it doesn't look like Goziza, and therefore we're not worried that people will see it and misunderstand. Yes, Gary?
Could we, I didn't realize that he'd said it was because it would look like Goziza. Could it be read to say, as part of the definition of Goziza, you're separating the wool from the flesh, and because it's not being physically separated, for that reason, it's not meeting the midaraisa of Goziza.
This is an excellent point. One could have thought that was Peshat in the Mishnah, in which case it would have very interesting and staggering implications that the cutting of the wool off the body of the sheep is not the Gozez, or not just Gozez, but also the removal of the wool from the animal is also part of the Gozez, and that would have all sorts of halachic implications. Rashi, however, explicitly tells us it's not Peshat in the Mishnah. I also, when I read the Mishnah, began thinking in that direction, until I saw Rashi, who says that this is incorrect. Simply, that's not the case. Gozez is cutting the wool off the animal. The only reason why removing it makes a difference is because the external observer will think I'm shearing the wool of a bechor, which I'm not allowed to do, therefore don't remove it. But in truth, this form of gozez is allowed in order to make possible shechita taking place. Okay, so this is the Mishnah. The Gemara now discusses, okay, that's all well and good with respect to bechor. How would this translate across to respect to Hilchos Yom Tov? Now, the Gemara speaks about Hilchos Yom Tov because Hilchos Shabbos, you are anyway not allowed to do shechita. It's also on Shabbos, and therefore the allowance of doing gozez in order to allow and enable and facilitate shechita wouldn't make sense in Shabbos. But on Yom Tov, where you are allowed to do shechita because of Eichel Nefesh, would there be a similar allowance with gozez? Omarav, halacha Rabbizobin and Shalom, boy minei Rafana. Excuse me, connecto Yom Tov mahu. What would be the halacha with Yom Tov? Are you allowed to do gozez on Yom Tov in order to facilitate shechita? Talmud Rabbi Zobin and Mishnah, Mishnah the Kasava Todesh Lav Hanu Gozez or Yom Tov Asa. Is the allowance of Rabbi Zobin and Mishnah that Todesh, you're plucking out the wool, pulling, yanking out the wool, as opposed to cutting it, as opposed to shearing it, and Todesh is not Gozez, and therefore on Yom Tov it would be forbidden not because of Gozez, because it isn't Gozez, but because of Oike Davar Mikudulei, because you're uprooting something from its place of growth. In which case, with bechor, where all that's forbidden is gozez, you can yank the hair out and therefore avoid doing gozez, and then it would be allowed to facilitate the shechita. But on Yom Tov, there's an additional prohibition of okedav and mikudoloi. Dilma, the almas of Rabbi Zobin and Mishnah Todesh Hani Gozez. Really, Rabbi Zobin and Mishnah holds that Todesh is gozez. By any time of the showing, the reason it's allowed is the Havadei Davar She'ein Miskavin, or Yom Tov Davar She'ein Miskavin Mutter. The reason it's allowed is it's because the Davar She'ein Miskavin. I have no interest in the wool. My only interest is in removing the wool as removing of a problem, and this is called a Davar She'ein Miskavin. It's an unintended side consequence. I have no interest in it being removed, and therefore that would allow it. Now, there are complications over here around this use of the concept of Dover She'einu Miskavin in this case and how that would work. But this is what the Gemara says, that therefore it would be allowed because I have no interest in removing the wool, just in facilitating the shechita. The Gemara on Omid Beis now carries on and says, Olam Sover Rav Dover She'einu Miskavin also. The allowance over here is not because of Dover She'einu Miskavin. The Toleish Lav Hainu Gozez, Toleish is not Gozez, but beyond of Hainu Tamid Shori, Dahavide Okedov and Megudolo Kilacha Yad. The reason it's allowed is because it's Kilacha Yad, because it's an unusual manner of doing it. The Toleish Lav Hainu Gozez asks Gemara, we have a contradiction because Al Sukya tells us that Toleish is Gozez. That's Reb Shimon ben Lakish, who says Toleish es Akonov v'Akoyt Tzmei v'Amarto Chayiv Shalosh Chatos Al Gemara, and the Gemara says that you're Chayiv because of Toleish Chayiv Mishum Gozez. That Toleish is Chayiv because of Gozez. The Rambam translates this to mean that Toleish is a tolda of Gozez. So how can we say that it's not Gozez? Answer the Gemara, Shani Konov to Hainu Urchi. It's different with a wing because this is the usual style of doing it. So what the Gemara is telling us over here, in the simplest reading of the Gemara, is that Toleish is not a tolda of Gozez unless it's the normal way of doing it with it. And when it comes to plucking feathers, this is the normal way of doing it, and therefore Toleish would be Gozez. When it comes to shearing the wool of an animal, Toleish would not be Gozez. In other words, this is different to just Lav Urche. This isn't just a concept of this isn't the normal way of doing it, and therefore it's a shinoi. The point is it isn't the melacha at all. Again, we've explained that a melacha is askus, an engagement. If you engage with something differently, even though the end result is the same, that would define it as a different melacha. Toleish and Gozez, the Rambam understands to be toldos rather than co-others, because Toleish is, even though the end result is the same, that I've removed the feathers off the bird or the wool of the animal, nonetheless, since I've done it in a different manner, it's a different asec, it's a different activity, and the activity, since the whole activity isn't usual with animals to pluck the hair, therefore this isn't the melacha. A melacha means a normal farming or production method, a normal method of achieving an outcome. And since this isn't the normal method of achieving the outcome, this isn't a melacha at all. This is the summary of the Gemara. In which case, we see that there's a chiluk between Toleish with a bird, which one's chayiv because of Gozez, because of chayiv b'hachi, and Toleish of an animal, which isn't Gozez because it isn't the normal thing to do with the animals. So this is the first thing that we've seen. We sort of, perhaps mistakenly, I in a sense spoke about this in the first shear, without having seen the Gemara and Bechoros. At the time, I didn't realize that we would have to see the Gemara and Bechoros, and this is the source of the first distinction. Now, I want to remind you at this point of the discussion we had about whether Toleish would apply even to a live and even to a dead animal, or only to a live animal. And it turns out this is a machlokas rishonim, as we discussed, I think, in our previous year. The Rambam in Perek Tes Halacha Zayin, which I printed on the sheet, says that the melach of Gozez even applies to a live animal. And the Meiri brought from the Rashi, which is Rashi on the Rif. We don't have it in our Rashi. A girsa that says that only from a live bird or chayiv for Gozez or Toleish, not from a dead animal. And there are other rishonim like the Ureim and others that say this explicitly. So this is the first element. Does this apply to dead or alive animals? There's a Tosefta that seems to say it applies even to dead animals. This is how the Rambam paskins and other rishonim argue with it. There's a second shaila over here, which is if you do say that Gaziza applies la'achamisa after an animal is dead, would the issa of Talisha, of being Toleish, apply to an animal after it's dead? In other words, Toleish mechayim wouldn't apply. Would Toleish la'achamisa apply? Toleish mechayim doesn't apply because lav or chaybachi. The way you take the hair or the wool off an animal is by shearing or cutting as opposed to pulling. Would this apply also to when you are shearing or cutting, when you are plucking an animal, pulling off an animal once the animal is dead? And the svara of the chiluk would be that the reason you don't pull wool off an animal is because it's painful. The animal struggles, and therefore it's not a practical way to do it. But once the animal is dead, then the chiyuv would apply. And as the Gemara in Bechoros, which says that toleish is a melacha with an oath, with a bird, with a konof, with a wing and a feather, but not with an animal, the argument would be that's only mechayim, but not la'achamisa. If you hold that Gozez applies mechayim, then la'achamisa, Gozez applies even after an animal is dead, then toleish would be the melacha after it's dead, though not when it's alive. Very interesting idea. The toleish as a tolda of the melacha only with an oath or with a dead animal, but not with a live animal because of determining how it works. I already mentioned in the last year that this discussion about whether Gozez applies to a live or a dead animal is not a small discussion. It may be connected with a very different definition of the melacha, whether the point of the melacha is that you're separating something from its sustenance, equivalent to harvesting, or whether the point of the melacha is simply the production of hair and wool, in which case it would even apply la'achamisa. Now, the Mishnah Berurah, printed in on the last page of the handouts, in source 8, brings in the name of the Taz that one couldn't pluck hairs la'acha misa. Avol toleish biyad min hamesa, derech litrish k'mo ligzois. So he brings that it is the derech to be toleish even with an animal if it is la'acha misa. And based on that, he says, I think I mentioned this, if you wear a sheepskin coat, you have to be careful not to pull hairs out from the coat, or a fur coat. You have to be careful not to pluck hairs from your dead fur coat, your dead sheepskin coat, even la'achamisa. So those who wear fur coats, if something becomes knotted in the fur, and you want to pull out a little bit of chewing gum that came knotted in the fur, and you want to pull it out, you want to tug it out, and in so doing, you will pull hair out. The Mishnah Berurah says that it is osa. I would humbly suggest that the Rambam, I think, argues on this, and this is brought in the Aruch HaShulchan. I don't believe, as far as I could see, that the Mishnah Berurah mentioned this, and this is a little surprising, but I did see that the Aruch HaShulchan mentions this. If we look again back in the Rambam in Perek Tes Halacha Zayin, the source that we keep on looking at in the I printed it in source 5, I think, on the handout. Look in the language of the Rambam. The Rambam says, Gozez semer osea, whether it's alive or dead, you're chayiv. And then he says, how is that told us Gozez? If you pluck a feather from a bird, this is a tolda of Gozez, which would seem to imply explicitly that it's only toleish min ha'oif that is a tolda of Gozez. Again, here the flow of the Rambam. The Rambam says if you shear an animal, whether alive or dead, you are chayiv. If you pluck from an oath, from a bird, then you are chayiv. Seeming to imply that if you pluck from an animal, even a dead animal, you would be potter. So it seems that we have a explicit Rishon who says that toleish would not be chayiv from a dead animal. However, there, as I said, the Mishnah Berurah brings poskim that disagree with this, and there do seem to be Rishonim that also disagree with this, and therefore it will turn out that it's probably a machlokus Rishonim. So this is
saying that? Sorry, you're saying that a tolda, it's only a tolda from a bird because he says bird explicitly. You couldn't argue that he would say that it would also be a tolda if you're pulling hair from the beged that the Mishnah Berurah brings.
I think this is a very strong diuk in the Rambam, because the Rambam explicitly mentions with an animal whether it's live or dead, and only mentions Gozez, whereas with toleish, where he says it's a tolda, he only mentions a bird. So I think that's a pretty clear source.
Could one say that with toleish from a bird, that toleish from a dead bird, that the Rambam might say that was not chayav?
I don't believe. I hear your point, because the Rambam doesn't say it explicitly with a with a bird, but the Rambam doesn't exclude either. He doesn't say anywhere that he doesn't distinguish anywhere between whether it's a dead bird or a live bird, and therefore I don't think there would be any source in the Rambam to say such a thing. Because the Rambam just says if you're toleish.
Yeah, but with Gozez, he does specifically say whether alive or whether dead. So, and he doesn't say whether, or he doesn't give any indication of that in relation to.
I think the answer is that the Rambam felt there's 2 points over here. First of all, I think in the language of the Rambam, the diuk is not a good one. And secondly, based on the Gemara, I don't think it's correct. Meaning to say that the Gemara Bechoros makes no such distinction, and the Rambam all the Rambam is saying, let's not forget, is that Chodesh is a tolda of Gozez. So unless he tells us otherwise, the presumption would be that we would transfer across the principles of Gozez from Gozez to Chodesh. Now it is correct that Rabbi Roman Rambam and Karen both pointed out that toldas are very different to others, and they don't necessarily need to obey the same rules. Nonetheless, in absence of evidence to the contrary, the assumption would be that if the Rambam 3 lines before said that the Av applies whether to live or dead, the same thing would apply to the Tolda. So this is the second point I wanted to make on the Sugya. The third point I wanted to make on the Sugya is another diuk in the Rambam, which is whether Gozez would be a malacha with an oath. And all the Gemara tells us in Bechoros is that Tolesh doesn't apply to animals because it's lav and chaburah, but Tolesh does apply to birds. It doesn't technically tell us the opposite way around, which is whether Gozez applies to birds or not. And there are Rishonim who are explicit that Gozez applies to birds also. In other words, it's not mutually exclusive. The Chiddush of the Gemara is that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says that Tolesh applies to birds, and that only means to birds, but not to animals, because of lav and chaburah. Does Gozez, though, also apply to birds? So the Rambam, again, I think is explicit that it doesn't. Because the Rambam says, Gozez semo say, if you're Gozez, you're chayiv, whether from a behema or a chaya, and he doesn't mention anything about oath. The only time that oath comes into the equation, a bird comes into the equation, is when it comes to Tolesh. There the Rambam says that Tolesh min oath. So I think the Rambam is clear that Tolesh doesn't apply, that Gozez doesn't apply to a bird. I think that Rashi is also meduyuk like that, because Rashi adds in an unnecessary couple of words when he explains the Gemara. The Gemara in Bechoros, if you go back to the second page of the handout, where you have Rashi and the Gemara, the last comment of Rashi, Tahainu Urchi. So Rashi is going on the line in the Gemara in which the Gemara says that for a bird you're chayiv for Tolesh, but not for an animal, because a bird it's Tahainu Urchi. Rashi says derech notes as oath litlosh. The style of the way of taking feathers off a bird is by Tolesh, v'lo legozez, and not to shear it. Now Rashi didn't have to add that. Rashi could have simply said that the way to take feathers off a bird is to pluck the feathers. It could also be that you do gaziza with a bird. Rashi seems to be saying that the only derech that you would do with birds is Tolesh, whereas Gozez shearing would be something you don't do with birds, and that the gaziza wouldn't apply with birds. So this, in a sense, concludes the diukim that I wanted to bring from the Gemara and the Rambam. I'm not going to go through the whole Ritva. If you have time, the Ritva is well worth reading, just because it's very fascinating, even though it takes us too far off topic, and therefore I don't want to use the sheer forum to do it. But the Ritva makes a number of interesting points, including that la halacha oike dava megedoloi doesn't apply by taking hair or feathers off an animal. The malacha is only Gozez or Tolesh, but not harvesting. He doesn't believe that harvesting makes sense. And the nafkamina of this would be whether you could pluck the feathers or the wool around the makom hashchita mechaim on Yom Tov while it's alive on Yom Tov, meaning to say that if there's no difference between plucking when an animal is alive or when an animal is dead, because Gozez is not the equivalent of kota. The point of Gozez is not that we are detaching the hair or the feathers from their living source, but simply you're separating them off the animal. Then since you're anyway going to have to pluck the feathers when you eat the animal, and we're allowed to do that for Oichel Nefesh on Yom Tov, there's no difference between whether you do it when it is alive or when it's dead. Because either way, for the sake of Oichel Nefesh, you will have to do the identical malacha. So this is another nafkamina as to whether Gozez is about detaching something from its living source, or whether Gozez is simply removing hair and wool from an animal. If it is the latter, then it makes no difference whether you do it alive or dead, because either way, before you eat the bird, you will have to defeather it, you'll have to remove the feathers from it, and therefore this would be mutter to do whether it's alive or dead, because Eichel Nefesh doesn't care when you do it, because either way you'll have to push it away. Whereas if the malacha, if there's an additional aspect of removing it from its living source, then this would be something that's also do. So this is the fascinating comment that the Ritva makes, another nafkamina in the subject, but I'm not going to go through this inside. For those of you who aren't used to the code language of the Ritva, I'll simply just tell you when he quotes various figures. He quotes Rabbeinu Harav HaChassid. Harav HaChassid is Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah was known as a chassid, a very pious individual. Rabbeinu Yonah wrote Shari Teshuvah, a work of ethics, and therefore acquired the name Harav HaChassid. He also quotes Rabbeinu Zal, my teacher, and then he says that this teacher quotes it B'Shem Rabbo Rabbeinu HaGadol, in the name of his Rebbe, Rabbeinu HaGadol. The Ritva was a grandson, not biologically, but in Masorah of the Rambam. The generations go as follows. The Rambam had several students, and the Ritva was a student of those students. The Ritva was a student of the Rashba and the Ra'ah, who both lived in Barcelona, and the Ritva learned from both of them, and they both quote their Rebbe, the Rambam. So the Ritva had two traditions going back to the Ramban, and in this case, he quotes his Rebbe, who's the Ra'ah, in the name of Rabbeinu HaGadol, the great Rebbe, the Rebbe of my Rebbe, who is the Ramban. So that's just so you understand the language of the Ritva. The Rashba and the Ra'ah lived in Barcelona, and we have many fascinating machlokas between the two. To have two such Gedolim living in close proximity, both Talmidim and the same person, was something very special. So this is anyway the machlokas between the Rishonim about plucking from an oif and a behema. And what I want to point out is that we need to be careful when we read the words lav or chayu b'hachi. This isn't the normal way to do it, or it's not the derech to do it. The Gemara in Choros uses this word in two different contexts. Sometimes something not being the way to do something is kilach hayad. It's a shinoi. You can do something in an unusual manner, and it would be a shinoi. That means to say that I have done the melacha, but I've done the melacha in an unusual way. It is the melacha, but done in an unusual way. The other way, so that's when the Gemara uses the word kilach hayad. Then the Gemara says lav ul chayu b'hachi. It's not the way to do it. There, the lomdus of the Gemara is not that this is kilach hayad. The point is that I'm doing the melacha, but just in an unusual way. But since lav ul chayu b'hachi is not a normal way of doing it, it's not a melacha at all, because melachas are about production methods of engaging with producing particular outcomes as part of changing the world. The siddur, the pas, the bread making process, or in the context of these melachos, the garment making, the fabric making process. If it's lav or chay b'achi, it's not the normal way of doing it, the Gemara is arguing that it doesn't qualify as a tolda at all. So this is a second distinction. This is probably the makor of the Rambam that tolesh is a tolda, not an av. Because if it was a ko-av, then it wouldn't matter whether it happened to be yochai with this particular animal or not. The point is it would be one of the melachas, and then if you do it with an unusual animal, it'd simply be an unusual way of doing it. However, since it's a separate melacha, it's the melacha of tolesh, not the melacha of gozez, albeit one is a tolda of the other. Therefore, the Gemara argues that if it is an unusual thing to do, that melacha would never be defined in the context of this particular creature. So that's again just another principle that we draw out from this Gemara. And from my point of view, that draws to close what I wanted to say on Gozez. I'm happy to have a discussion via WhatsApp, or perhaps you can just share here if they want another session on Tuesday, just to give time for everyone to digest Gozez, or whether people are ready to move on to the next sugya. Perhaps if anyone has particular views on the matter, please feel free to share it.